Welcome back, everybody, to another edition of Irish Illustrated ISO. I am Tim Priester of Irish Illustrated. And late last week, we had the opportunity to sit down with Mike Denbrock, Notre Dame's offensive coordinator, Chris Ash, Notre Dame's defensive coordinator. And I know we've talked about this. Tim O'Malley and Pete Sampson had a Irish Illustrated Insider podcast on Monday, and they talked a lot about what was said, and we've gone over this and written about it, but I still feel like there's some finer points that need to be made, especially as it relates to Mike Denbrock and him talking about the offense, some of the things he said about wide receiver. I know that you guys have heard this, but I want to give my perspective on it a little bit and see if we can put a finer point on it. And, Denbrock talked about immediately when we interviewed him, we jumped right into year one, what he was trying to accomplish and how things are different in year two. And he talked about year one, about just trying to find out who that offense, who they could be, what the scheme would be exactly, and if they could be competitive in all phases of the game. Of course, running it and throwing it on all the nuances that go with both aspects of that game. Now it's year two, and I can relate to a lot of these things, and I'll get into that in a little bit. But he talked about drilling down on the details and focusing in on specific situations and being very specific with stances and fundamentals. And we hear these things all the time, both as members of the media and fans. And it's like, yeah, it's coach speak, it's coach speak, but there's a lot to it. And one of the comments that he made, now that they're in year two of this, is that as he looked back on year one, he said there were details missing all over the tape. And if we can just fix that, the leap we could make offensively could be pretty good. Now, this we're talking about the nuances and really understanding the game better, understanding the scheme better. And he said, upon the conclusion of the season, you evaluate and you look at it from 10,000 feet and you start to evaluate what fits, what doesn't. And then you get into the spring and you look at, you evaluate the tools that you have and how you can maximize, the skill sets that you have. And all of these things, when I hear these things, it calls to mind. I had the opportunity to coach one of the greatest things I've ever experienced in sports when I went into coaching my high school baseball team for 9 years, Mishawaka Marion High School. Most of you are familiar with that. Mishawaka, right next to South Bend. And when I'm hearing Mike Denbrock saying these things, I'm thinking to myself, this is exactly what I experienced, because my first 4 years as head coach, we went to the sectional championship the first 4 years and we lost every damn one of them. And you start to wonder, like, am I doing things right? Are we doing this the proper way? What are we forgetting? And what it really comes down to is that, you know, the nuances, I keep saying that word, but the little things like running the bases, cutoffs, how you run the bases with a ball hitting the gap when you're on second and less than two outs. That's a baseball perspective. You have the football perspective, which has baseball has a ton of nuances because it's nine players at a time. Football, my goodness, 11 on 11, one offense, one defense, special teams. There's a million things to drill down. So I understand where he's coming from, and here's what happens. Let's say you were a freshman playing for Mike Denbrock last year. Well, you start to hear his stuff for the first time. Now, let's say you're a senior playing for Mike Denbrock. You're hearing all these things for the fourth time or for the fourth straight year. And then it becomes automatic to players. So I understood where he was coming from, and I thought it was important. And I just wanted to do that little segue because these are things that we generally take for granted, and you can't, especially with as much as at stake with Mike Denbrock and Notre Dame and the millions amount of dollars that they're making and what's at stake and advancing in the playoffs and the pressure that goes with that. There were 18 people in the stands when I was coaching. That's not much pressure, but a lot of that is self-inflicted. And with a guy like Denbrock and Notre Dame, obviously it's really, really magnified. And he talked about, and I know this surprised some people, this was a topic of conversation on the Four Horsemen Lounge for IrishIllustrated.com. And he said, we were not very confident in anything in the passing game a year ago. And again, that what that calls to mind for me is they've got to throw the football downfield. That the sentiment that they're not throwing the football downfield, and I agree. You do have to keep defenses honest, but he needs to keep the offense on the field. And three and outs are poison for a football team for an offense. You keep sending the defense back out there, and so yeah, you want to see Notre Dame take deep shots. Mike Denbrock's trying to keep the offense on the field. And if a deep shot is a low percentage play, you don't want to keep pressing that button. It was magnified during the playoffs. I don't remember exactly where. Maybe it was in the national championship game, but it's several places along the line where Notre Dame's success rate on third and long was horrible last year. So to just keep pushing the ball down the field when that's a low percentage move is not the right thing to do. So he's trying to come up with ways to be more efficient, stay on the field, and get those wide receiver details in order. And that's where a guy like Jordan Faison, Jaden Greathouse, those two guys should be infinitely further ahead this year, this spring, this summer, and this fall than they were last year. They have to be, when this season starts at the end of August, they have to be locked in. Those two guys have to hit the ground running. Look how long it took for Greathouse to finally, put it all together. And Faison had the injury in the first game of the year at Texas A&M, and then the re-injury. Those guys have to hit the ground running. Then you bring in you have the veterans coming in with Fields will be in this summer, and Will Pauling being able to do some things this spring, but you can see just the veteran nature of a guy like that and what he will do for the offense. Mike Denbrock said, I think we'll take a huge leap in year two, and it's all of these little things that if they can hit the ground running, they will be in much better shape offensively the second year. Now you're going to have a new quarterback, and you got to develop all of that chemistry. At least your quarterbacks are on the field this spring, whereas last year Riley Leonard wasn't. Now the big concern, and this is a real point of emphasis for Denbrock, is the drop passes by the wide receivers last year. He says it's focus, concentration, finishing catches. One of his catchphrases on the practice field this spring is catch the football with your eyes. We remember the drops. Bo Collins was the biggest offender. Jordan Faison had his fair share of drops. I wouldn't say Greathouse had a ton of drops, but boy, did he have a big one against Northern Illinois and a deep ball that could have absolutely changed the outcome and the tenor of that game in the second half. So they've got to be better at that. Denbrock says it really doesn't matter who's throwing you the football, especially in the spring. You've got to be precise with your routes, be where you should be, and then the football is going to be in close proximity to you as a wide receiver, which gives you a better chance to concentrate and make the play. So, they have things that they need to improve upon. You've got a bunch of young wide receivers. They need at least two of about a half dozen young wide receivers to hit to really round out that wide receiver core. But those are some of the things that Mike Denbrock is focusing on this spring. He started our conversation with them by saying, "I will answer any question you have." I'm paraphrasing. I will answer any questions you have as long as it's not about the quarterbacks. Now he ended up talking a little bit about Steve Angeli and the confidence that Angeli has expressed, and he's earned the right to have that confidence. When he was in the game last year during the regular season, he came through. He performed well. The first time he started against Oregon State in the Sun Bowl, he performed very well. And we all know, as we've said many times, that his performance at the end of the first half against Penn State, who knows? I mean, at that point, Notre Dame is doing nothing offensively. And if Angeli doesn't give them a spark and raise the confidence of the entire team beyond, before the end of the first half and kick a field goal, who knows if Notre Dame picks up where he left off when Riley Leonard took over at quarterback to start the second half against Penn State. But confident, this is what Denbrock said. I mean, he's confident now, Angeli, that look, he's in a real battle now. He's got a shot at winning the starting job, competing against CJ Carr and Kenny Minchey. Denbrock said, this is what Angeli's thinking to himself. You know what? This is my job. When they give it to me, I'm going to be ready to go. And that is the way that Steve Angeli is carrying himself. How is this going to all work out? We're not going to have resolution at the end of the spring. And if there is resolution, they're certainly not going to announce it. Now you have to be transparent with your quarterbacks. It's 2025, and we live in a very transparent world between coaches and players these days, especially at Notre Dame. That's a calling card for Marcus Freeman. He's well known for that. So the quarterbacks are going to know where they stand upon the end of the spring. And, depending upon what kind of transfer portal activity the Notre Dame quarterbacks are involved in, that'll give you a pretty good idea of how the transparency of the coaching staff with the quarterbacks. But CJ Carr is a tremendous talent. He has the highest ceiling of all the quarterbacks. I think it would be accurate and fair to say that. Kenny Minchey is a guy who probably provides the best athleticism. He joked with Marcus Freeman about having comparable running abilities as Riley Leonard. There's a big difference there. Riley Leonard's about 3 inches taller, about 25 pounds heavier, and a really, really great athlete. Mitchie's a very good athlete too, but he's not going to be able to do what Riley Leonard did running the football, because Leonard could do it. He could run around people, he could run through people, and virtually every time it was a 3rd and short or a 4th and short, you could count on Riley Leonard, picking up the necessary yardage. Now, I thought one of the interesting things that Mike Denbrock talked about was, they have to, whoever Notre Dame's quarterback is, even if it's Minchie, he's not going to run nearly as often as Riley Leonard, and isn't going to pick up the yards and the first downs like Leonard did. So it's Denbrock's job to figure out, how do I make up for the yardage that we're going to lose by not having Riley Leonard a quarterback. One of the interesting things he said was, you have to look at direct snaps. Now, he didn't say specifically who you would snap the football to directly, but as you can imagine, Jeremiah Love would probably be a good guy to play that wildcat role and snap him the football directly. He said Denbrock maybe do more motion, pre-snap motion, which Tommy Rees did a ton of, to the point where people made jokes about. Jared Parker did very little of it. And so somewhere in between lies Mike Denbrock and his attitude towards that. But that's another thing that you have to look at to try to compensate for the yardage lost on the ground by Riley Leonard. He said you also have to account for the defense with the extra guy in the box. You need dynamic playmakers to sting their butt, is the way that he put it. And so, you look for those playmakers. You'd like to have Jordan Faison up and running right from the beginning of the season. That's a dynamic player. We know Jeremiah Love, and they will try to find others within the offense to do that. Mike Denbrock said that the quarterback, whoever the quarterback is, and it's not like Angeli can't run, and it's not like CJ Carr can't run. Angeli showed he could run, a little bit in the Sun Bowl. He showed it against Purdue. I realize Purdue's not a great barometer, but he can move when he has to. But again, the difference without Riley Leonard is the running quarterback. Mike Denbrock said the quarterback will still run, but it won't be featured. And clearly, with Riley Leonard at quarterback, the running game of the quarterback was featured. All you have to do is look at the first series of the national championship game against Ohio State, and you'll see how much Notre Dame featured Riley Leonard in that first drive, that great drive that seemed to set the stage for some great things. But Ohio State had other ideas at that point. So, to use the phrase that Denbrock did, it's a balancing act on offense, and you have to find. He looks at it, and I know he mentioned this last year when he came in, that you look at a general amount of points and yardage per game. let's say you have an offense that's producing 440 yards per game. Okay, how do you match that? How do you make up for the loss of Riley Leonard? Maybe you emphasize the screen game more. Maybe you throw the ball to the running backs more. Maybe you throw the football to the tight end more. And last year that was a little bit problematic because Mitchell Evans was coming off of a knee injury, and that leads me into Eli Raritan, who we were recently asked by an Irish Illustrated subscriber whether Eli Raritan had the ability to become another great Notre Dame tight end. And I hesitated to say great tight end because I know there's been some indications along the way that maybe his get off at the line of scrimmage isn't where Notre Dame would like it to be. But the very key factor is, and it's applicable to Raritan as well as Mitchell Evans, is when you suffer torn ACLs, ACLs and Achilles, I've said this before, ACLs and Achilles generally take 2 years recovery. And we saw Mitchell Evans start the season very slowly as the second half of the regular season came along, really November. We started to see more and more out of him. And Eli Raritan had two torn ACLs. And Denbrock said that Raritan, quote, has a chance to become one of the really good ones here. But he said, health equals confidence. And when you're coming off one of those two injuries, there's some doubt. And again, the quote that Denbrock used was that at a certain point, maybe about the midway point of the regular season, Raritan said, "Hey, I'm okay to do this again," where you finally trust that knee coming off the torn ACL. So with that trust that Raritan had in himself, you saw Mike Denbrock have a little bit more trust in him. They threw the ball to him a little bit more, and he's healthy enough. As Denbrock said, he was healthy enough to play early on, but it still comes down to the player believing that he's healthy enough to excel and just cut it loose. So, Eli Raritan could be a really, really key part of this offense if he can maximize his ability. So those are just some of the things I want to talk about Mike Denbrock and the thought process that he goes through now that he goes into the second year, and that repetitive nature of the message that he wants to share with his players starts to hit home a little bit more. And hopefully you'll see an uptick in the productivity of the offense right from the start. But again, you got that transition at quarterback, although it was a transition for Riley Leonard too, and he didn't reach his full abilities as a passer until much later in the season. You remember, in addition to having the left shoulder injury, a lot of people were calling for Steve Angeli to replace him, but Notre Dame stuck with Riley Leonard because Mike Denbrock and Marcus Freeman knew the upside of a Riley Leonard, and they were absolutely correct because it led them to the national championship game. As it relates to Chris Ash, we're still getting to know him, and he emphasizes, he said this when he was introduced to us in a press conference, and again last week when we met with him, that what they're doing defensively is, quote, close to mirroring what's been done in the past. And I think that he's overemphasizing that because he doesn't, it's the right attitude to have. You're not going to reinvent the wheel when the wheel was invented by Al Golden right before you. So, you try to build on that. You try to fine tune the blueprint, maybe, so to speak. And as Chris Ash put it, try to identify some things we can do better or put players in positions to help accentuate their skill set, which I think is a really telling comment. And we were talking about Jordan Botello brought it up. Botello and Bryce Young talked about what they're doing defensively with their strong side defensive ends, and instead of a 6 technique, move them out a notch to 7 technique, and that does a couple of things. One, it creates a little bit of space with the get off between the defensive end and the tight end or the tackle. So it gives them a little bit more ability to maneuver and get a running start. It helps set the edge, which Chris Ash is going to be a real stickler. I know most defensive coaches are, but he's going to be a real stickler about funneling everything inside. Notre Dame, at another podcast, we'll talk maybe more extensively about the defensive tackles. But if you look at the defensive tackles Notre Dame has, I know that they lost Riley Mills, who became a really good interior defensive lineman. And Howard Cross was really banged up the whole year. He pulled a hamstring in the summer, never really completely got healthy, and then had a nasty ankle injury. So pretty much his entire season was sabotaged. But if you look at that interior defensive line, with the addition of Jared Dawson and Elijah Hughes, I would encourage people to go check out irishillustrated.com today for a story I did on those two, because they're really seeing the praises of the environment and the culture that they're walking into at Notre Dame. But you take Jared Hughes. I'm not really sure where Jared Dawson. I'm not really sure where Elijah Hughes is going to be in the pecking order, but we talked to him last weekend. That's a big dude. He's listed at 6'3", 290. He looks bigger than that. And this is a guy that's got really, really good, really quick get off, which is a trait of Jared Dawson's as well. So these two transfers come in with a really, really quick get off. Dawson's tough, not huge, but tough. He's got the ability. He really has three techniques: size, and quickness, but the toughness of a nose tackle as well, which he'll be playing a lot of. Those positions can be a little bit interchangeable. So you take those two, you take Rubio, the return of Jason Onye. They are very, very excited. I know Al Washington, talking to him recently, how excited he is about coaching Jason Onye, who went through some issues last year, but he's back and bigger than ever. He's like 18, 17, 18 pounds larger than he was when he left the team after 5 games last year. So you have Dawson, you have Hughes, you have Onye, you have Gabe Rubio. Very, very important for him to get through the summer and preseason camp healthy. He was injured. He broke his foot on the first day of practice last August. Get him through this healthy. Armel Mukum's a guy that flashed a little bit. Donovan Heinisch will be a little bit bigger. He'll never be a 315 pounder, but he gained a ton of experience. And then there's Mukum, who contributed a little bit last year early. I know a lot of people are asking about Sean Sevillano. I think with all of these guys, I think his time to shine will come more in 2026. But there's some guys there for them to work with, and um, Chris Ash now in a position to. I asked him if he had ever, in his previous experiences as a defensive coordinator, whether he had ever just been a coordinator and not had a position to coach. And no, this is the first time he's done it, and he's pretty excited about that because it gives him a chance to, as he said, be a walk around guy, be the head coach of the defense. That's very important. When I was, again, dipping back into my coaching in high school, I had a pitching coach that I always said, you are the head coach of the pitching staff. And when you empower a guy like that, it makes a difference. It makes a difference on the person coaching it, and it makes a difference on the players that are being coached by him. So I think that's important. He said, I can sit in on different meetings. I can watch drills. I get to see all the players instead of just his position group through portions of the practice. And it allows him to, jump in and maybe assist the other defensive position coaches into working some things into some drills, maybe some offshoots of maybe what they're working on, and then talking points to work their way through it. I thought it was interesting when I asked Chris Ash who he felt the leaders would be because of the leadership loss from this team. Now he didn't coach Mills or Cross or Kaiser or Watts or Morrison, but that's a ton of leadership that has left the team. And I mentioned this on a recent Irish Illustrated Insider podcast, but without hesitation, Chris Ash said Drake Bowen. He said Drake Bowen's well respected. He's intelligent. He said there's a number of other guys on the defense that are leaders, but he named one, and he said Drake Bowen. And so when we talk about who are going to be captains this year, I know Bowen's just entering his third year in the program, and he didn't play as a freshman, and was a regular, played a ton. Of course, with a 16-game schedule. And I wouldn't be shocked if he ends up being a junior captain this year, and maybe not the only one, just because of all the leadership talent that walked out the door. I thought it was interesting to hear Chris Ash talk about Jalen Sneed. He said, I love the kid. He's athletic, physical. He gives us position flexibility. We will put him on the field to do a lot of different things. Now, we know Jalen Sneed has the skill set to do that. And that's why ultimately he ended up leading the defense last year in third down stops, which is huge. You put him on the field on third down, and most of the time you knew you were going to get off the field. The offense is going to get the football back because of what Jalen Sneed did. Now, Sneed's going to have to be much more disciplined. He can't freelance. He's got to stick to the plan. He's got to understand what his job is. He has to remember that he's 1/11th of the defense. But I'm really, really interested to see how Chris Ash utilizes Sneed and whether he can get even more out of him than Al Golden did. And Al Golden got him to the point where he led the defense in third down stops. But there's more. Jalen Sneed has more, and we'll see if Chris Ash can get that out of him. Jumping back to the defensive line, again, something that Ash said was that, Onye and Dawson and Hughes, they're new to him. So it's like getting three new, defensive linemen into the equation. He was asked about Jalen Stroman, and it's disappointing that Jalen Stroman is not out there this spring. Well, he's out there this spring, but he's not participating because he had to have that broken clavicle reworked on. So he's taking a lot of mental reps, which we hear that phrase all the time. But Ash was quick to explain that Stroman's a pro, and so he feels confident that once he gets physically prepared to play, he will understand everything that he needs. That's a very physical football player. And that's the great thing about him and Devontae Smith. Look for an upcoming story on Devontae Smith on IrishIllustrated.com. He is extremely physical, and you like having those new additions. Well, that's also the case with Dawson, with Jared Dawson, a guy with a lot of physicality. I veered off earlier, and what I was getting to was that Ash talked about that we'll play primarily nickel. That's his quote. He said they can play bigger with personnel groupings, obviously, in certain situations, but it's a nickel game. I said, is it a 4-2-5 game? And he said, well, I wouldn't necessarily say that, but it's a nickel game. And the reason he wouldn't say that is because, look, there's different terminology. You can say 4-2-5 or a 3-3-5, and they're essentially the same if you have a stand-up linebacker at the edge. Do you still call that, like, let's say Jalen Sneed's lined up off the edge in a 2-point stance with three other guys in a 3-point stance? You can say that's a 4-man front, or you can call it 3-3-5 because he's stand up. It's just all terminology. But the bottom line is that there's going to be a lot of defense played with nickel personnel, and that was certainly the case with Al Golden. And now Chris Ash, I asked him if it was like Christmas in March here in spring practice. Now it's April, but Christmas in March, to have a nickel handed to him with the abilities and the physicality of Devontae Smith. He did a lot of really quality things at Alabama, and so it makes it really easy, without any hesitation, to say this is predominantly going to be a nickel defense, especially when you have a guy like Devontae Smith handling that position. We talked about the 7 technique and the ability to get wide on. Another thing about playing that 7 technique for a strong side defensive end is that it forces tight ends to take on a big, physical, athletic guy with a little bit of space pre-alignment to work him over. So you put a lot of pressure on the tight end. And as I mentioned, the key is to protect the perimeter, and that's what aligning your strong side defensive end outside a little bit does. But you better be stout at defensive tackle and at linebacker. And I think Notre Dame is ultimately going to be that. I think these defensive tackles are going to work out really, really well. And we already know what a quality linebacker core Notre Dame has. You lose Jack Kaiser, you add Madden Fremo to the situation with everybody else back. So it's a really good situation that Notre Dame has there, and that's just again some of the nuances of what Chris Ash is trying to do up front, not changing a whole lot, just tweaking it and making sure that you take advantage of a very promising defensive end position for Notre Dame. A couple other things before we wrap up. Bryce Young, he said the sky's the limit. I think we all know that, but to hear a new coach say it, he's already discovered that. Um, he talked about, the pieces of defensive end. He's very excited about it. Of course, they don't have Botello at full go, and they don't have Traore, and so that's going to complete the picture. But Ash was also asked whether he spoke to Al Golden, about just what he was inheriting, and he really didn't. I'm a little surprised at that, but he did say, you want fresh eyes on you want your own fresh eyes on the personnel, and you don't want any preconceived notions going into it. If I were in that situation, I probably would have wanted to talk to Al Golden just to pick his brain a little bit. But Chris Ash is a very confident coach as it relates to the staff that he inherited. He said, "I hit the football lottery," which I thought was a really great phrase and speaks highly of the rest of Notre Dame's coaching staff on the defensive side of the ball, with Bulla and Mickens and Marty Biaggi helping out there as well, with L. Washington up front. And he said he was asked about the safeties. He didn't get specific, but he said they can really run and they can hit. And we know, we know a Don Schuler can run and hit. We've seen evidence of Luke Telich run and hit mainly on special teams, but it's applicable. Urlacher can run and hit. We know that. And then Stroman has he has a proven body of work of great physicality while playing for Virginia Tech. He just has to stay healthy. So those are some of the things I wanted to discuss, not only about Chris Ash and some of his thought process, but Mike Denbrock as well. We will have another Irish Illustrated ISO coming up, and I think we'll do something similar along these lines, focusing on specific positions, maybe a little bit more tuned into what each of those defensive tackles can do, because I do think that there's a great deal of potential there, a level of potential that we probably weren't looking at a couple of months ago when we were anticipating the turnover of defensive tackle without Mills and Cross. So just wanted to share some of those thoughts with you today. This has been Tim Priester from Irish Illustrated and Irish Illustrated ISO.